Welcome, class, to the chapter on political identity, nationalism, religion, and class. All of you should be currently reading chapter 7 or have wrapped that reading up. And this lecture will make a heck of a lot more sense to you if you've read it ahead of time, or at least the first half of it, hopefully. But rather than carrying on with the traditional way of splitting my lectures into two parts, this one I think we can just do all in one swoop, um, because it's not quite as there's not quite as much information or content to cover here. Nevertheless, this stuff is still very important to the study of comparative politics, and so let's go ahead and kick things off with sort of the big terms. Um, well, attitudes are essentially the way in which people think about the political process as a whole. It's concerned with the speed and methods of political change, generally classified, and you'll hear people throw these terms around like radical, liberal, conservative, or reactionary. Particularistic, relative to the specific context of a given country. What may be considered radical in one country is a relative term in another country. It may be considered conservative, and so just keep that in the back of your minds as we cover this chapter. Um, Political attitudes are distinct from political ideologies, although there is a little bit of cross pollination there. So the broad definition, um we've got these views that are regarding the necessary pace and scope of change and the balance between freedom and equality. We've got our different categories here. There are four of them listed. Um and one thing that maybe I was going to back up on for just a moment before we get into radicals, liberals, conservatives, um, and well, I have radicals, a little bit more context given for radicals there, in terms of their preference for large institutional change, but they're also seeking to restore political, social, and economic institutions, whether or not those are real or imaginary, excuse me. Um, but you might want to try as we're going through this chapter to think of or begin to develop some examples of people or movements with radical political views. This could include something like the Arab Spring movements from 2011, Russia's or Iran's recent protest waves, or we may even go back a couple hundred years ago to the American Revolution, 1776. Um, let's talk about conservatives for a moment. Sort of from a historical example, the British political theorist Edmund Burke valued liberty, but was concerned about the rapid changes that were taking place in France during the Revolution of 1789. Burke had saw people losing control and setting in motion changes to the basic structure of society that they would not be able to control ultimately. So British conservatives therefore sought to prevent large scale institutional changes to the British system of government or to the society writ large. A more modern example, many Christian Democrats, including the party in Germany, that would be the Christian Democrats like Angela Merkel, who's no longer in power. But they favor supporting traditional institutions, family, religion, and community. Um, More modern reactionaries, some have argued that Trump's support base may reflect more reactionary than conservative principles. Um, his campaign slogan of "Make America Great Again" does certainly have a little bit of a desire to return to an nostalgialistic past. And so that's one thing to kind of consider. Um, this way of thinking about it makes sense if the question is, how open are people to change, right? In the 1990s, communists and socialists had, they sought left wing um, social change, more power for unions, restrictions on capitalism. Those were mostly active in supporting change. And as a result, the terms radical and liberal came to be associated with leftist politics. Hence the title of this slide, On the Left, Radicals and Liberals. I'm trying to give a delineation here to showcase or highlight a few bullet points here that distinguish radicals and liberals, so that because there is a distinction, they aren't the same. In many countries, though, this wasn't really the case. I mean, in North Korea today, as an example, a person advocating democracy and free markets, they'd be considered a radical. Okay. Um, Radicals and reactionaries also have, other traits in common. Both support violence in some instances, and both are seeking regimes as fundamentally illegitimate, those existing regimes. On the other hand, liberals and conservatives accept the legitimacy of existing regimes. And so this sort of brings us to some competing views on the continuum. Radicals are extreme liberals, reactionaries are extreme conservatives. Hopefully, that much makes sense. Um, Ideologies are about what kinds of policies people would ideally prefer their government to pursue. This helps explain why in the United States liberal sometimes means left wing. Okay. Um, Here we have some sort of competing views. Radicals and reactionaries want dramatic change. They're willing to engage in violence, as I mentioned just a bit ago. Liberals and conservatives are supporting existing institutions to various degrees. And in liberalism, what's the role of the state? Well, before I get into that, we want to distinguish political ideologies. There are, I guess, four separate kinds of things we should look at. Ideologies are going to go ahead and set political values regarding the fundamental goals of politics. They're going to be exemplified by five dominant modern ideologies: liberalism, communism, social democracy, fascism, and anarchism. The thing about liberalism, communism, and social democracy is that those are going to be in a later chapter, chapter 8, when we get into international political economy. They are associated with economic values as well. But for our purposes here in this chapter, we're just looking at it from a political perspective. The third part is this universalistic, but not specific to one country or time. Obviously, things are changing. And then finally, distinct from political attitudes, which I had mentioned in the opening. So um, we have basic values held by the individual about fundamental goals of, um, sort of politics, or the ideal balance of freedom and equality. And so here are a few types and their goals. Liberalism, we're going to be advocating for individual freedom. Communism, economic equality. Social democracy and socialism, the balance between freedom and equality. Fascism, the advancement of a superior group or race. And finally, anarchism, the elimination of state power. In terms of liberalism, what's the role of the state? What are the acceptable state actions? In other words, what makes liberalism different from anarchy? If one is going to kind of, take a look at that. As far as the United States is concerned, liberal often refers to someone who supports left-wing policies. In Australia, the Liberal Party is more center-right. And so the confusion is that liberalism refers to both an attitude and an ideology. A liberal attitude is going to support more gradual change within existing institutions, and a liberal ideology is placing a high value on personal, political, and economic liberty. We have a quote here on this slide from Thomas Jefferson, where he states the legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others, but it does not, but excuse me, but it does mean no injury for my neighbor. To say there are 20 gods or no God neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg. Um, and so, liberal democracy, this system of political, social, and economic liberties supported by competition, participation, and contestation. Um, well, the meaning of liberalism is varying, right? Um, it's you know it's slow. Liberalism is favoring slow and evolutionary change. Um, as a political ideology outside of North America, it's favoring free markets and individualism, accepting greater inequality. As a political ideology within North America, it's favoring a greater state role and limiting inequality. Many outside the region would call this ideology social democracy. And as a political economy, it is favoring a limited state role in the economy. Okay. Next, we get to communism. This is the idea here is that communists believe that political liberty without economic equality is an illusion. As long as there is economic inequality, people will always be subject to coercion and manipulation. So the only way to have true freedom is to free people from the constraints of a market economy. That is the gestalt or the overall belief of the ideology of communism. Next, we have social democrats who are seeking to create a balance between individual freedoms and economic equality. European states with market economies that also feature large welfare states and government services in support of economic equality. Those are the states and countries that come closest to achieving this ideal. In terms of fascism, the idea under this ideology is that it's any system based on individualism will be inherently weak. So cut the individual out. We don't want to. Fascists don't want to have a system based on individualism. It's too varied. It's too different. Each person, right? And so the nation is essentially an organic whole, and individuals are best motivated by appeals to their common racial consciousness. This is the belief of fascists. Far right nationalism has seen a resurgence in Europe in recent years as a reaction to the continent's economic troubles, as well as to increasing immigration, including an influx of refugees from the Syrian conflict, um, Palestinians, Gazans. Now, where we have a war between Israel and Gaza, this is only going to create further problems, um, as well as the major war that's taking place between Russia and Ukraine. But far right parties are doing better in the polls, and anti immigrant protests and violence um, against immigrant communities has been on the rise. Okay, next up we have anarchism or anarchy. This is a system that has never been implemented, although strains of it emerge in various protest movements. Libertarians in the United States are one such group, as they see government itself as the primary threat to freedom and equality, rather than if a government's going to be an enabler of freedom and equality, those are some of what our other ideologies posit. So most comparativist scholars, they would point out that states play an important role in societal organization. So considering that anarchy seems to be an ideology found in functioning states, but not in failed states, it may reflect a classic example of what we could call a luxury political ideology. Okay, let's go ahead and move into religion, fundamentalism, and the crisis of identity. Many of the ideologies that we've just covered, liberalism, communism, etc., those ideologies fit into what Max Weber described as the disenchantment of the world. That is basically to say that the replacement of faith in the mystical and spiritual by faith in the material world, in human institutions, and in the notion of progress. The rise of political identities such as citizenship, nationalism, and ideology led to the privatization of religion, which entailed removing faith from the public sphere and relegating it to private life. So, one point to make here is that in recent decades, we have seen this focus more and more on secular politics that come under attack even in developed Western countries. Some of it's because, in the face of major crises, such as the 2008 financial crisis, which we had never seen anything on that magnitude since the Great Depression. Um, we had two of the most dominant secular ideologies, liberalism and social democracies, that were essentially under attack. They had difficulty coping with these major crises, leading people to revert to the sort of perceived safety of old beliefs or try something different. If this isn't working, then there's got to be a change and something has to give. So for countries who secularism was weakly institutionalized, so it never really had a deep hold on a country's political culture. One thing to maybe consider or think about is whether the shift toward anti science views could be anti vaxxers, flat earth believers. That could be a cause or consequence of this anti secularism shift. Um, After all of these things relate to the rejection of the status quo, often for very emotional reasons. And so one could say that there is a political psychology at play here. Okay, fundamentalism. This is really where we get into the crisis of identity. Um, Fundamentalism is the idea that a set of religious ideas can govern society. It's an alternative to political ideology as it explicitly rejects the idea, at least in principle, that humans can govern themselves. Instead, fundamentalists seek to implement a divinely ordained set of laws that do not, according to their views, derive from human thought. Fundamentalism is not religiosity, Puritanism, or religious conservatism, as these movements generally disengage and isolate themselves from the political sphere. It's not pre-modern. It seeks not to return faith to a pre-modern role, but rather to restructure religion as the central political identity, to make faith the sole foundation for a modern regime. It's a result of reactions to modern issues and to social isolation, often felt by people who are overwhelmed by such a fast changing world. And we do live in a very rapidly changing world. What happened yesterday is essentially old news. And if you don't change or adapt to the world in which you live in, then you're going to get left behind very, very quickly. terms of regarding political attitudes, fundamentalists they can at times be radical, reactionary, or a combination of both radical and reactionary elements. They speak of returning to a golden age of faith, but their prescriptions for change are reactions to modern problems, and the political systems they envision are utopian rather than grounded in historical realities or historical examples. Because fundamentalist belief systems tend to, be held by a minority in most countries, it's more frequently associated with extremist and fringe elements in society, such as terrorist groups like ISIS. 1979 Iranian Revolution was an example of a rare, successful fundamentalist movement as it succeeded in establishing a political system in Iran that powered the clerical establishment. The Taliban had succeeded briefly. Now it's being returned back to the Taliban currently in Afghanistan. But for the most part, fundamentalist movements seem more typical of radical non state actors than of legitimate political players. You might be able to think of several fundamentalist groups like Boko Haram and the Christian fundamentalists, such as the members of the Westboro Baptist Church in Topeka, Kansas. They're a big one here in the United States, are one to highlight and for this discussion. But sort of looking at multiple fundamentalist groups from different religions can be a good way to point out this ideology. This is one that any religion can produce, Christian or otherwise. So these fundamentalists of different religions often have more in common with one another than they do with more moderate practitioners of their own religion. So it's not to paint these individuals or people who are part of these groups. We can't paint them all with the same brush. They are unique in their own rights. Okay, up next is political culture. Um, Culture is a kind of social roadmap. It provides us with norms and priorities that guide people as they organize their lives. So, in contrast, we can think of political culture as something that shapes how people behave in their public political lives. In some countries, it's commonly accepted that the state plays no role in promoting a particular religion, which will, at least in the United States, why we have a separation of church and state. We don't have a state or a central government, a federal government that is, you know, essentially advocating for one religion over another. And we can't bring about our politics to do things in such a way through education, through policies that we make, etc. And so that's why under the First Amendment we have freedom of religion. So this sometimes in other countries the state is expected to play a role in promoting religion, family values, and deference to authority. So in this slide, I think this might be this is my last slide here. This last slide, I'm going to leave you with two views of political culture: Huntington's class of civilizations and Englehart's world values survey. These are a couple different ways political scientists have approached the study of political culture. The clash of civilizations, while very common in politics, pop culture, has largely been discounted by political scientists. Mark Lawrence, he had written about Ukraine and ISIS and how they're not justifications of a clash of civilizations, because he points out that because of this framework, it's not withstood and had any kind of withstanding on empirical scrutiny. It dramatically oversimplifies a world of complexity. It overpredicts conflict between civilizations at the expense of conflicts within civilizations. It focuses on states rather than separatist or terrorist groups, and it significantly is worse than the rival theories at predicting international conflict. And so Samuel Huntington wrote this, what became an article that, if pretty easy to find online. Clash of Civilizations is where the fault lines of political conflict were going to be taking, and he makes this argument that when cultures bump up against one another, these are where future wars are going to break out. He turned this article into a book, and I'm not going to bore you with it right now, but those are the points that Huntington makes. And you know, political scientists like to argue about this article, but it is a big one in the field to take into consideration. But shifting to a different approach to culture, Englehart's World Value Survey. This is based on a series of surveys carried out across multiple countries and time periods. Englehart then classifies political values into certain universalistic principles. He looks at traditional versus secular, rational, and whether or not that is largely self-explanatory. But there are times when I find that students, when I'm teaching this course, they can struggle to differentiate survival versus self-expression. The survival values emphasize economic and physical security and are associated with low levels of trust. And on the other hand, the self expression values are focused on higher levels of tolerance and demands for individual participation in politics. So, by focusing at the individual level, Englehart is able to show how much variation exists within broad cultures and individual countries. Another key finding that he has is that political values shift over time and often very suddenly. The survival self expression areas are especially tied to economics, which is a major argument of Englehart's post material values argument that he makes. And so I think the gestalt for Englehart is that culture may be a sticky issue, but it's also very dynamic. So this is hopefully I've left you with a couple of areas that you can sort of investigate a little bit further. Obviously, talking about this on the last slide for 4 or 5 minutes, I can't do it justice, but it is something to definitely look into a little bit more if these two last pieces sort of interest you in any way. We will be taking up chapter 8 on political economy next. Thank you.